The sun over Redemption Gulch. Arizona was a merciless god, hammering the dusty earth into a cracked and brittle shell. It was the summer of 1883, a time when the promises of the West had faded for many, leaving behind a residue of grit, sweat, and quiet desperation. For Sheriff Jedediah "Jed" Stone, the heat was a familiar torment, a constant companion in the twilight of his career. His bones ached with the memory of colder dawns and harder fights, and his once sharp eyes, the color of a faded blue sky, now saw the world through a haze of weary resignation. Redemption. Gulch was Jed's town. He hadn't founded it, but he had tamed it, transforming it from a lawless den of prospectors and card sharps into a semblance of civilization. He'd done it not with a quick trigger finger, though his was as fast as any, but with a steady hand, a shrewd mind, and an unyielding sense of justice that was as much about fairness as it was about punishment. Now in his late 50s, with a shock of silver hair and a face carved with the lines of 1,000 hard decisions, he was more institution than man. He was the rock against which the chaotic tides of the frontier broke and receded. His one remaining vanity, his single indulgence in a life of Spartan discipline, was his horse, a magnificent buckskin stallion named Rooster. The horse was a legend in its own right, a powerful animal with a coat the color of spun gold, and a spirit as untamed as the land itself. Jed had raised him from a colt, and the bond between them was the stuff of local law. Rooster was more than just transportation. He was a friend, a confidant, a living symbol of the strength and freedom Jed felt slipping through his grasp. It was on a Tuesday when the heat was so thick it felt like you could chew it that the unthinkable happened. Jed had left Rooster tethered outside the sheriff's office, a practice as routine as his morning coffee. He was inside, poring over a stack of wanted posters, the ink bleeding slightly in the humid air, when Deputy Miller, a young man with more ambition than sense, burst in his face pale under a sheen of sweat. "Sheriff, he's gone." Jed looked up slowly, his mind still on the smudged face of a train robber. "Who's gone, son? Spit it out." "Rooster, Sheriff. Your horse, someone's taken him." The words hit Jed like a physical blow. He shoved his chair back, the legs screeching in protest against the wooden floor, and strode outside. The hitching post stood empty, the frayed end of a rope dangling in the still hot air. A cold knot of fury and violation tightened in his gut. In Redemption, Gulch stealing a man's horse wasn't just theft. It was a declaration of war, an act that often ended with a short drop and a sudden stop. Stealing his horse was sacrilege. "Miller." Jed's voice was dangerously quiet, a low rumble that promised a storm. "Saddle my spare mare, and get me my rifle." The trail was easy to follow. The thief was clumsy, desperate. The tracks were small, the stride short. Not a man, Jed realized, but a boy. This didn't soften his resolve. It sharpened it. A boy desperate enough to steal the sheriff's horse in broad daylight was a boy who had nothing left to lose, and that made him dangerous. He rode for 2 hours, the sun beating down on his neck, his anger simmering. He found them in a shallow arroyo, the boy trying to calm the agitated stallion. Rooster, loyal to a fault, was having none of it sidestepping and tossing his head, refusing to be led by this strange, small creature. The boy couldn't have been more than 12. He was a scarecrow of a child, all sharp angles and hollows, dressed in rags that hung from his emaciated frame. His hair was a matted tangle of sun-bleached brown, and his face was smeared with a mixture of dirt and tears. But it was his eyes that stopped Jed in his tracks. They were wide and fierce, a startling shade of green, and they burned with a desperate fire that Jed recognized all too well. He'd seen that same look in the eyes of cornered animals and dying men. When the boy saw Jed, he froze his hand, still clutching Rooster's reins. He didn't run. He simply stood his ground, his small body trembling but his chin held high in a pathetic display of defiance. Jed swung down from his mare, his rifle held loosely in one hand. "You've got a lot of nerve, son," he said, his voice flat. "That's my horse." The boy swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin throat. "I know," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I was just borrowing him." "Borrowing?" Jed let out a short, harsh laugh. "That's not what this looks like. This looks like stealing. And you know the penalty for horse thieving." The boy flinched, but he didn't look away. "I was hungry," he said the words, a simple, stark confession. "I was gonna sell him in the next town, just to get enough for some food." Jed's eyes swept over the boy again, taking in the skeletal thinness, the sunken cheeks. He'd seen plenty of hungry people in his time, but this was different. This was a child on the brink of starvation, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had discarded him. "Where are your folks?" Jed asked, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. "Don't have any," the boy replied, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Ma died of the fever last winter. Pa, he went looking for gold 2 years ago. Never came back." The story was tragically common, a familiar refrain in the harsh symphony of the West. An orphan left to fend for himself, invisible to a world that had no time for the weak. Jed looked from the boy to his magnificent horse. Rooster, sensing his master's presence, had calmed, nudging Jed's shoulder with his nose. The fury that had propelled Jed on his pursuit had evaporated, replaced by a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge in a long, long time, a deep, aching pity. He could arrest the boy. He could take him back to Redemption Gulch, lock him in a cell, and let the circuit judge decide his fate. That was the law. That was his duty. But as he looked at the defiant, terrified child before him, another path unfolded in his mind, a path that diverged sharply from the well-worn trail of law and order. He saw the boy's future laid out before him, a life of petty crime, of running and hiding, of growing hard and cruel, until the day he inevitably ended up on the wrong end of a rope. Or he could offer something else. A choice, a chance, the kind of chance no one had ever given him. "What's your name, son?" Jed asked. "Silas," the boy mumbled. "Well, Silas," Jed said, hooking his thumb in his belt. "You've got a choice to make. I can take you back to town and lock you up. Or you can come work for me, earn your keep. You'll have a roof over your head and food in your belly, and you'll learn how to look after a fine horse like this one instead of stealing him." Silas stared at him, his green eyes wide with disbelief. He seemed to be searching for the trick, the hidden catch. "Work for you." He repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "But I stole your horse." "You did," Jed agreed, "and you'll be paying for that mistake for a long time to come. You'll muck out his stall every day. You'll groom him, you'll feed him. You'll treat him better than you treat yourself. That'll be your penance. But I'm offering you a life, boy. A chance to be something more than a common thief. It's more than most men get." For a long moment, Silas said nothing, He just stood there, the dust swirling around his bare feet, the weight of the old sheriff's offer settling on his narrow shoulders. Then slowly, deliberately, he let go of Rooster's reins and took a single, hesitant step forward. It was a small movement, but for both of them, it was the crossing of a threshold, a step into a new and uncertain territory. Taking Silas in was the most impulsive thing Jedediah Stone had done in 30 years, and it sent ripples of gossip through Redemption Gulch. "Gone soft in his old age," muttered the men at the saloon. "Taking in a thief, a no-good drifter," clucked the women at the general store. Deputy Miller was openly appalled, seeing it as a sign of weakness, a crack in the foundation of law that Jed had so carefully built. Jed ignored them all. He set up a cot for Silas in the small room at the back of the sheriff's office, and he put the boy to work. The first few weeks were a battle of wills. Silas was sullen and silent, a feral creature unused to kindness or routine. He worked with a grim determination, his small body straining with the effort. But he refused to speak, unless spoken to, his eyes always guarded, always watching. Jed was patient. He didn't push. He didn't pry. He simply provided a steady, predictable presence. He taught Silas how to properly care for Rooster, showing him how to brush the golden coat until it shone, how to check the hooves for stones, how to mix the feed just right. He taught him how to handle a gun, not as a tool of violence, but as a means of defense, a responsibility to be respected. He made Silas sit with him for meals, forcing the boy to eat slowly to savor the food, instead of wolfing it down like a hungry dog. Slowly, painstakingly, the walls around Silas began to crumble. He started to talk first in monosyllables, then in halting sentences. He told Jed about his mother, about the songs she used to sing, about the cold winter that took her. He spoke of his father, a man he barely remembered, a ghost chasing a phantom fortune. Jed in turn found himself opening up in ways he never had before. He told Silas stories of his own youth, of the rough and tumble world he'd grown up in, of the mistakes he'd made, and the lessons he'd learned. He spoke of law and justice not as abstract concepts, but as a living, breathing thing, a fragile balance between right and wrong, mercy and retribution. A strange, unspoken bond began to form between them, a bond forged in the shared solitude of the sheriff's office, in the quiet rhythms of their daily lives. Jed, the lonely, aging lawman, found a purpose beyond the badge. Silas, the lost, forgotten orphan, found a home, a father figure, a reason to hope. But the shadow of Silas's past lingered. The townspeople never fully accepted him. They saw him as the boy who stole the sheriff's horse, a wolf in sheep's clothing, waiting for the chance to show his true colors. Every broken window, every missing chicken, brought suspicious glances his way. Silas learned to live with it, to hold his head high, and meet their accusing stares with a quiet dignity that he learned from Jed. But the whispers and the mistrust carved a deep wound in his young soul, a wound that even Jed's kindness couldn't fully heal. One evening, about a year after Silas had come to live with him, Jed found the boy sitting on the steps of the office, staring out at the setting sun, his face a mask of sorrow. "What's on your mind, son?" Jed asked, sitting down beside him. "They'll never see me as anything else, will they?" Silas said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I'll always be the boy who stole your horse." Jed put a heavy hand on his shoulder. "What other people see doesn't define who you are, Silas," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's what you see in yourself that matters. You're not that boy anymore. You're a good, honest young man. You've worked hard. You've paid your debt. And I'm proud of you." It was the first time Jed had ever said those words, and they were a balm to Silas's wounded spirit. He looked up at the old sheriff, his green eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. In that moment, he made a silent vow. He would spend the rest of his life proving Jed right. He would be a man the sheriff could be proud of. He would be a son worthy of the father he had found in the most unlikely of places. He would protect this town, this life, this man who had saved him no matter the cost. It was a promise made in the quiet of a desert twilight, a promise that would one day be tested in the crucible of fire and blood. Part 2. 7 years passed. The dust of Redemption Gulch settled into new patterns, and the merciless sun etched deeper lines into the faces of its people. The town grew not in a boom, but in a slow, steady crawl. A new church steeple pointed a hopeful finger at the vast, indifferent sky, and the saloon now had swinging doors that creaked a constant, mournful rhythm. Silas was no longer a boy. At 19 he stood tall and lean, the hollows of his youth filled out with hard-earned muscle. He moved with a quiet, watchful grace that seemed at odds with his age, a stillness born of years spent on the periphery observing. The wild, desperate fire in his green eyes had been banked replaced by a low, steady flame of resolve. He was Jed's shadow, his right hand, his unspoken deputy. He could read a trail better than any man in the county. His draw was smooth and sure, and he understood the heart of a horse in a way that bordered on mystical. For Jedediah Stone, these 7 years had been both a gift and a burden. The aches in his bones were a constant nagging reminder of his own mortality. He'd pinned the deputy badge on Miller 5 years back, a political necessity to appease the town council, but it was Silas he relied on. The bond between them had deepened into a seamless, quiet understanding. Jed would glance a certain way, and Silas would be already moving, anticipating the need. The love he felt for the boy was fierce and paternal, a quiet pride that was the central pillar of his aging life. It was also a source of constant, simmering frustration, because no matter how capable Silas became, no matter how unwavering his loyalty, Redemption Gulch had a long memory. To many, he was still the horse thief. Deputy Miller, now a man puffed up with a sense of his own importance, made sure of it. Miller saw Silas not as an asset, but as an affront. He resented the easy camaraderie between the sheriff and his ward, interpreting it as a slight against his own official position. He never missed an opportunity to cast suspicion on Silas, to remind the townsfolk of his origins with a sneering remark or a pointed question. The simmering tension came to a head on a sweltering August afternoon. The payroll for the local silver mine, a small but vital operation, was delivered by stagecoach and stored in the sheriff's safe, awaiting armed escort the next morning. It was a tempting prize, and Jed, feeling a familiar unease, decided he and Silas would stand watch through the night. Miller was pointedly excluded. No need for all 3 of us to lose a night's sleep, Jed had said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You've got patrol in the morning." Miller had stalked away, his face a thundercloud of resentment. The night passed in silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the soft murmur of their voices as they shared a pot of coffee. In the morning, the mine foreman arrived with his guards. Jed turned the dial on the heavy iron safe, the clicks echoing in the quiet office. He swung the door open and froze. The canvas bags of coin were gone. In their place, nestled on the empty metal shelf, was a single, tarnished silver dollar. The silence that followed was absolute. The foreman's face went white. Jed stared, his mind refusing to process the scene. It was impossible. The office had been locked. He and Silas had been the only ones there, taking turns sitting in the main office while the other rested in the back room. It can't be, Jed breathed, reaching a trembling hand toward the safe. It was then that Miller burst in his face, a mask of feigned shock and righteous indignation. "Sheriff," I heard the foreman shout. "What's happened?" His eyes went from the empty safe to Silas, who stood rigid by the window, his expression unreadable. Miller's gaze narrowed, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. "It's gone, Miller." "The payroll," Jed said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Gone." Miller's voice dripped with insinuation. He took a step toward Silas. "Well, I'll be. Only 2 men in a locked room. One of them the soul of honor, the other. Well, we all know a leopard can't change its spots. That's enough." Deputy Jed snapped his voice, cracking like a whip. But the seed was planted. The foreman, a man named Henderson, looked from the empty safe to Silas, his eyes filled with dawning suspicion. The story spread through Redemption Gulch like wildfire. The horse thief had finally shown his true colors. It didn't matter that he'd have to have robbed the safe while Jed was mere feet away. Fear and old prejudice were more potent than logic. Silas said nothing in his own defense. He simply stood tall, his jaw tight, his green eyes fixed on Jed. He was waiting to see if the faith Jed had shown him all those years ago was still there. "I was awake the whole night, Henderson," Jed said, his voice low and steady, his eyes never leaving Silas's, and so was he. No one came in or out, and Silas never went near that safe. I'd stake my life on it. Jed's word was still law in Redemption Gulch, but for the first time it was met with doubt. The mine owner, a wealthy investor from back east, was furious. He demanded an arrest. The town council wavered. Miller fanned the flames, whispering in the ears of anyone who would listen. The trust Jed had built over a lifetime was cracking under the weight of this single impossible crime. The only person aside from Jed who seemed to have no doubt in Silas's innocence was Sarah Thompson. She was the blacksmith's daughter, a young woman of 18 with a calm demeanor and eyes the color of warm honey. Her father, a burly, pragmatic man named Thomas, was one of the few who had treated Silas with a measure of fairness over the years, respecting his work ethic and quiet competence. Sarah had seen past the whispers and the stares to the core of the young man beneath. She and Silas had a shy, unspoken friendship, often exchanging quiet greetings as he passed the smithy. That afternoon, she brought a basket of fresh bread and stew to the sheriff's office, a simple act of defiance against the town's turning tide. She found Silas alone cleaning Jed's rifle with meticulous, focused movements. "I brought you and the sheriff some supper," she said, softly, placing the basket on the desk. Silas stopped his work, his hands stilling on the cool metal of the rifle. He looked up, and for the first time she saw the deep hurt in his eyes. "You shouldn't have, Sarah. People will talk." "Let them," she replied, her chin held high. "I know you didn't do it. Anyone who really knows you knows it." Her simple declaration of faith was like a cool drink of water in the desert of his isolation. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "Thank you, Sarah." Their quiet moment was shattered by the sound of a horse galloping into town at a furious pace. It was a sound that promised trouble. Silas was on his feet in an instant, the rifle in his hand, his personal turmoil forgotten in the face of a new threat. He and Jed met on the porch as a lathered horse skidded to a halt, its rider slumping in the saddle. He was a prospector from the hills, his face ashen with terror. Outlaws. He gasped, pointing a shaking finger back the way he'd come. A whole army of them. They wiped out the Miller brothers' homestead, burned it to the ground. They're led by a devil, a man they call Rattler Cain. The name fell into the charged atmosphere like a lit match. Jedediah went pale. It was a name he knew, a name from a dog-eared wanted poster buried deep in his desk, a name associated with a string of brutal robberies and killings across the territory, a ghost he'd hoped would never materialize in his jurisdiction. The bounty on Rattler Cain was $5,000 a king's ransom. How many? Jed asked, his voice grim. At least 30 of them, the prospector stammered. Riding under a black flag. They're moving slow, deliberate. Heading this way. A cold dread settled over the town. The stolen payroll was forgotten, replaced by a much more primal fear. 30 men, an army. Redemption. Gulch had a dozen able-bodied men at best. They were ranchers and shopkeepers, not fighters. That evening, as the town huddled in fear, and Jed tried to formulate an impossible plan of defense, a lone rider approached from the south. He carried a white flag of truce. He was a wiry, hard-faced man, with cold, dead eyes. He stopped in the middle of the street and called for the sheriff. Jed and Silas met him, their rifles held ready. A message from Mr. Cain, the outlaw, said his voice a gravelly sneer. He spat a wad of tobacco near Jed's boots. He's got a proposition for you. He knows you got a problem in this town. A thief in your own house. Jed's blood ran cold. What are you talking about? The outlaw grinned, a humorless baring of yellowed teeth. The mine payroll. Mr. Cain is a reasonable man. He's willing to find your thief and recover the money for you. In exchange, he wants safe passage supplies and a small tax for his troubles. Say 10% of the recovered funds. It was a classic piece of outlaw extortion, a wolf offering to protect the sheep from a phantom fox. But there was something else in the man's eyes, a calculating cruelty that went deeper. And how would he know about our stolen payroll? Silas asked, his voice dangerously level. The outlaw's grin widened. He looked directly at Silas, a long, appraising stare. Mr. Cain makes it his business to know things. He knows all about this town, knows all about you, Sheriff. And he especially knows all about you, boy. He pulled a folded, grimy piece of paper from his pocket and tossed it into the dust at Silas's feet. He said to give you this, a little family reunion. With that, the rider wheeled his horse around and galloped back into the descending twilight. Jed kept his rifle trained on the retreating figure until he was gone. Then he looked at Silas, who was staring down at the piece of paper as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. Slowly, with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, Silas bent down and picked it up. He unfolded it. It wasn't a letter. It was a photograph, old and faded, its corners soft with age. It showed a young woman with a gentle smile and sad eyes, holding a bundled infant. Standing beside her, with a possessive hand on her shoulder, was a young man. He was handsome in a rough, dangerous way, with a confident smirk and eyes that held the same startling green fire as Silas's own. Silas felt the world tilt on its axis. He knew the woman. It was his mother. He had a smaller, more faded version of this very picture, the one thing he had left of her. But in his copy the man had been torn away, leaving only a jagged edge. He looked at Jed, his face a canvas of dawning horror and disbelief. His voice was a choked whisper. The man who went looking for gold. He said the pieces of his life rearranging themselves into a new monstrous shape. My father. Jedediah looked at the photograph, then back at the boy he had raised as a son. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. The impossible robbery, the single silver dollar left behind a calling card, the scout's knowing, taunting words. It all made a terrible, horrifying kind of sense. Silas Rattler, Kane, the butcher, the outlaw, the monster riding down on them with an army at his back, was not just coming to burn their town. He was coming home. Part 3. The silence that fell in the sheriff's office was heavier than a tombstone. The fading daylight cast long, distorted shadows across the room, turning familiar objects into monstrous shapes. The photograph lay on the desk between them, a small, damning piece of evidence that had shattered the foundations of Silas's world. He stared at the smirking face of his father, the man who was a ghost in his memory, now resurrected as a demon on the horizon. The resemblance was sickening. It was in the set of the jaw, the high cheekbones, and most of all, in the eyes. His own eyes. It can't be, Silas whispered, again the words a hollow denial. He sank into a chair, the strength gone from his legs. He felt a cold poison seeping into his veins, a chilling whisper that said, "This is what you are. This is the blood that runs through you." Jed moved with the slow, deliberate gait of an old man who had just been dealt a mortal wound. He didn't look at the photograph. He looked at Silas. He saw the color drain from the young man's face, the bewildered terror in his eyes. He saw the boy he had found starving in an arroyo, the defiant child who had grown into a man of quiet honor, now being crushed under the weight of an inheritance he never asked for. The blood of your father is not a brand on your soul, son. Jed said, his voice a low, rough rasp. He rested a heavy, trembling hand on Silas's shoulder. The contact was meant to be reassuring, but Silas flinched as if burned. How can you say that Silas looked up his face, a mask of anguish? He's a killer, Jed. A monster. And I look just like him. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure desperation. All these years, the whispers, the way they look at me. Maybe they were right. Maybe there's a darkness in me. The same darkness that's in him. No, Jed's voice was iron. I've known you for 7 years. I've seen the man you've become. I've seen your heart. There is no darkness in you, Silas. Only the good you've chosen to build day after day. But the words meant as a shield couldn't penetrate the armor of Silas's newfound horror. The robbery of the safe suddenly made a new, more sinister sense. It was a message, a cruel, calculated move to frame him, to isolate him, to turn the town and perhaps even Jed against him before the final act. His father, Anne, hadn't just abandoned him. He had returned to destroy him. The news, as it always does in a small town, traveled on the wind. The prospector who had brought the warning, the few men who had been on the street and seen the exchange, they all carried pieces of the story. By the time the lamps were lit across Redemption Gulch, the truth, or a twisted version of it, was on everyone's lips. Rattler Kane was coming, and his son, the horse thief, the sheriff had harbored for years, was right here in their midst. Fear is a poison, and in the veins of redemption, Gulch it ran hot and fast. It turned neighbors into strangers, and suspicion into certainty. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The casual trust that held the small community together disintegrated. Jedediah, knowing he had to act, strode to the church and rang the bell, its frantic clanging notes cutting through the terrified silence. A town meeting. It was their only chance. They gathered in the saloon, not the church. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer sweat and raw fear. The faces that turned to him were not the friendly, familiar faces of his town. They were the hard, frightened masks of people who felt cornered. Henderson, the mine foreman, stood with his arms crossed, his face grim. Thomas, the blacksmith, looked worried, his gaze flickering toward the door as if hoping Silas wouldn't show. And at the center of it all was Deputy Miller. His chest puffed out, his moment finally arrived. Jed stood on the small makeshift stage, Silas at his side. The decision for Silas to be there had been a silent one. To hide would be to admit guilt. He had to face them no matter how much it cost him. He stood straight and tall, his face pale but resolute, his eyes scanning the hostile crowd. He saw Sarah near the back, standing beside her father. Her expression was one of unwavering support, a tiny island of calm in a sea of fear. Rattler Kane and his men are coming. Jed began his voice, filling the room. We don't know why, but we know what he is. We have to be ready. We have to stand together. Stand together. It was Miller's voice, cutting and sarcastic. He stepped forward, a smug, self-satisfied look on his face. How can we stand together when the enemy is already inside the gates? He pointed a dramatic finger at Silas, his son. We've had a viper in our bosom all along. A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. That's enough. Miller. Jed warned, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. Is it? Miller challenged, emboldened by the crowd's support. This all started when the payroll was stolen. And who was here? Him now. His murderous father shows up playing some kind of game. It's a setup, the two of them working together. He's been Kane's spy all along. The accusation, absurd and poisonous, hung in the air. It was the final, brutal confirmation of Silas's worst fears. He wasn't just the horse thief anymore. He was the traitor. I am not his spy, Silas said, his voice shaking but clear. I am not him. Your blood says otherwise. Miller sneered. Tell me, Sheriff, he said, turning his attack to Jed. How can you ask us to trust your judgment? You brought this curse into our town. You defended him when he was a thief. You defended him when he robbed the mine, and you defend him now that his butcher of a father is coming to slit all our throats. Your sentimentality has doomed us all. This time the murmur was louder. The seeds of doubt Jed had seen earlier had taken root and blossomed into open dissent. His authority, once absolute, was crumbling before his eyes. Anyone who sides with me, meet me at the livery in 1 hour, Jed said, his voice tight with fury and disappointment. We'll make a plan. The rest of you, you can hide behind this fool and pray Kane shows you mercy. He turned and strode out of the saloon, Silas following close behind, the hostile stares of the townsfolk like daggers in his back. As they stepped into the darkness, the weight of their isolation settled upon them. The town they had protected was now against them. They were alone. Silas walked without seeing his mind a maelstrom of shame and rage. He ended up at the livery, the familiar scent of hay and horses, a small comfort. He went to Rooster's stall, and the great horse nickered softly, nudging his chest. Silas buried his face in the stallion's warm neck, the vow he had made as a boy echoing in his memory. "I will be a man the sheriff could be proud of." It felt like a bitter mockery now. Silas. He turned. It was Sarah. She had slipped away from the saloon, a lantern in her hand, casting a gentle glow. I heard what Miller said. She whispered, her honey-colored eyes full of a compassion that nearly broke him. "It's not true. None of it." "How can you be so sure?" he asked, his voice rough. "You saw the photograph. You heard them. My father is a monster." "I'm not looking at your father," she said, taking a brave step closer. "I'm looking at you. I've watched you for years, Silas. I've seen you with the sheriff. I've seen how you handle the horses, how you treat people, even when they're cruel to you. The man in that photograph is a stranger. You are the man who always holds the door at the general store. You are the man who helped my father fix his wagon wheel last spring and asked for nothing in return. That is who you are, not him." She reached out and for a fleeting second touched his arm. The warmth of her hand was a spark of light in his suffocating darkness. It was a simple touch, but it anchored him, pulled him back from the edge of the abyss. Before he could find the words to thank her, Jed appeared in the doorway, his face grim. Behind him were only 4 men. Thomas the blacksmith, his face set with grim determination. Old Doc Peabody, clutching an ancient hunting rifle, and 2 young ranch hands who worked for a spread south of town. 5 men, plus Jed and Silas. 7 guns against 30. "It's a poor showing," the blacksmith said, spitting on the ground. "The rest are holing up in their homes, hoping Cain just passes by." Jed nodded his gaze, finding Silas's in the lantern light. "It'll have to be enough." He looked at his small, loyal band. "Cain will hit us at dawn. He'll come down the main street, confident. We won't stop him there. We'll fall back to the sheriff's office and the smithy. They've got stone walls. We can hold out there. Make him pay for every inch." It was a desperate plan. A plan for a last stand. As Jed laid out the details, assigning positions, a lone fire bloomed on the ridge overlooking the town from the south. A single ominous flame, like the eye of a predator watching them. It was a signal. Cain was there. He was watching, and he was waiting for the sun to rise. Silas looked from the fire on the ridge to the small, determined group of men around him. He looked at Jed, whose faith in him had never wavered, even in the face of this terrible truth. He looked at Sarah, whose belief in his character was a shield against the poison of his own blood. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach. But something else was rising to meet it. A fierce, protective resolve. Cain had come to destroy his life, to reclaim him for the darkness. But this life, this town, this old man, this gentle girl was his. He had earned it, and he would not let his father take it from him. He looked at Jed and nodded his green eyes, so like his father's, now burning with a different kind of fire. It was not the fire of a killer. It was the fire of a protector. "Tell me what to do." "Sheriff," he said. Part 4. The hours before dawn were a special kind of hell. A profound, watchful silence descended upon Redemption Gulch, a silence stretched so thin it felt like it might snap. The air grew cold, carrying the scent of dust and dread. From their positions, Jed and Doc Peabody in the sheriff's office. Thomas and the two ranch hands in the smithy across the street. They watched the main road, their knuckles white on their rifles. Silas was with Jed, positioned at a side window that gave him a clear view of the livery and the alleyways he knew like the back of his own hand. Every creak of a floorboard, every distant coyote howl was a potential threat. In the long, quiet moments, Silas didn't think about his father. He thought about the weight of Jed's hand on his shoulder, the smell of Sarah's fresh-baked bread, the soft nicker of rooster in his stall. These were the things that were real. The man on the ridge was a ghost, a nightmare from a life he'd never lived. This town, these people, this was his life. The blood in his veins didn't matter. The choices in his heart did. As the first pale grey light began to bleed into the eastern sky, they came, not with a wild charge, but with a terrifying, arrogant slowness. They emerged from the southern haze like spectres, a dark tide of men on horseback. At their head rode a man on a jet-black stallion, a stark contrast to Jed's golden rooster. Even from a distance, Silas could feel the force of his presence. It was Rattler Kane. He was a dark mirror of Silas Lena, and harder, his face a road map of cruelty. But the eyes, even from 100 yards away, were the same. It was like looking at his own reflection in a shattered, muddy puddle. Kane's army flowed into the main street, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust that swirled in the nascent light. They were confident, laughing amongst themselves, expecting a town paralyzed by fear. Kane raised a hand, and they halted in the center of town, a formidable, intimidating force. Redemption. Gulch. Kane's voice boomed rich and charismatic, yet laced with venom. I've come for what's mine. That includes the payroll from your pathetic little mine, and it includes my son. He laughed, a chilling sound that echoed off the silent buildings. Send him out, and I might just let the rest of you live. The first shot came not from the sheriff's office, but from the smithy. Thomas, his face a grim mask of resolve, fired his buffalo gun. The roar was deafening, and one of the outlaws flew from his saddle. Chaos erupted. Kane's men, startled out of their arrogance, scrambled for cover, firing wildly at the two stone buildings. The air filled with the deafening thunder of gunfire, the whine of ricocheting bullets, and the panicked whinnying of horses. Glass shattered, wood splintered. From their fortified positions, Jed's small band returned fire with disciplined precision. Another outlaw fell, then another. The initial shock cost Kane's gang dearly, but they were seasoned killers. They regrouped using troughs and wagons for cover, laying down a withering field of fire. The defenders were pinned down, the odds turning against them with every passing second. One of the young ranch hands in the smithy cried out, clutching a bloody shoulder. Suddenly, a white flag appeared from the door of the saloon. Deputy Miller stepped out, his hands held high, his face a mess of terror and craven opportunism. Kane Rattler. Kane. Hold your fire, he screamed. The shooting subsided into a tense quiet. Kane trotted his horse forward, a cruel, amused smile on his lips. Well, well, a sensible man. I'm the law here, Miller shouted, puffing out his chest. Sheriff Stone has lost his mind. He's protecting your son. The traitor, I can help you. There are only 6 of them. 2 in the office, 4 in the smithy. They're low on ammunition. Help me and the town is yours." Jed's face went ashen. "The fool," he whispered. "The goddamned fool." Kane chuckled softly. He dismounted and walked toward Miller, his movements fluid and predatory. "You're the law, you say," he purred, stopping a few feet from the trembling deputy. "A man of principle. I admire that." Miller beamed, sweat pouring down his face. "Yes, a man of pragmatism." "Indeed," Kane said. He looked over Miller's shoulder at the silent town, then back at the deputy. His smile vanished. "There's only one thing I hate more than a lawman, and that's a traitor." Before Miller could react, Kane's pistol was in his hand. The shot was deafeningly loud in the sudden silence. Miller crumpled to the ground, a look of utter shock on his face, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Kane holstered his weapon without a second glance. The act of brutal, casual violence sent a wave of horror through the town. Windows that had been dark suddenly showed the pale, terrified faces of the townsfolk who had hidden, who had trusted Miller. Kane's message was clear. There was no bargaining with this devil. Inside the sheriff's office, Silas watched it all, a cold, hard fury solidifying in his gut. He saw the faces in the windows, saw the dawning realization of their folly. They weren't just going to die. They were going to be slaughtered. "We can't win a siege, Jed," Silas said, his voice low and urgent. "We have to break them." How Jed replied, reloading his rifle. "They've got us pinned." "Not all of us," Silas said. His eyes flickered to the back door, to the alley, to the livery beyond. A desperate plan born of his intimate knowledge of the town and his bond with a certain horse took shape in his mind. "You and Doc keep them busy from the front. I'm going out the back. I'm going to get Rooster." "That's suicide, son," Jed said, grabbing his arm. "No," Silas replied, his green eyes meeting the old man's. "It's the only way. He's expecting a fight in the street. He's not expecting a ghost in the alleys." He gave Jed's arm a firm squeeze. "Trust me." Jed looked at the young man before him, at the unwavering resolve in his eyes. This was not the starving boy from the arroyo. This was a man. His son. He nodded slowly. "Be careful." Silas slipped out the back door, a wraith moving through the familiar shadows. Gunfire still echoed from the main street, providing cover. He reached the livery, the air thick with the smell of frightened animals. Rooster was frantic in his stall, but the moment he saw Silas, he calmed, nudging him with a soft whinny. "Easy, boy," Silas whispered quickly, saddling the stallion. "We've got a job to do." He led Rooster out the back of the livery, into the network of narrow alleyways that crisscrossed the town. This was his territory. He mounted the powerful horse, his heart pounding in time with the distant gunfire. He took a deep breath, and then he urged Rooster forward. They exploded from an alleyway onto a side street, a golden blur of motion. Several outlaws positioned to cover the flanks turned in shock. Silas's pistol bucked in his hand, and two of the men went down before they could even aim. He didn't stop. He and Rooster moved as one, a force of nature weaving through the chaos, using the buildings as cover. He was a phantom striking from unexpected angles, sowing confusion and panic in Kane's ranks. Rattler Kane, directing the assault on the sheriff's office, heard the commotion and turned his eyes widening in disbelief as he saw the golden stallion and its rider. He saw his son not cowering, but fighting with a skill and fury that matched his own. A flicker of something pride-rage crossed his face. "He's mine!" Kane roared to his men, and spurred his own black horse forward to intercept. The final confrontation was not in the dusty main street, but in the open square in front of the church. Father and son reined in their horses, facing each other, the battle raging around them, momentarily forgotten. "I have to admit I'm impressed," Cain said, his voice laced with a possessive pride. "You have my fire, my blood. This is who you are, boy. Stop fighting it. Join me. Together. We can take whatever we want. I am nothing like you." Silas said, his voice cold and clear. He thought of Jed's steady kindness, of Sarah's unwavering faith. "You take, you destroy. You left my mother to die. You abandoned your son. The only thing I want is to see you pay for what you've done." "She made you weak?" Cain sneered. "And that old man, he filled your head with nonsense about honor. There is no honor. There is only power." "No," Silas said, his hand hovering over the butt of his Colt. "There is a choice. You made yours. I've made mine." He looked past his father at the steeple of the new church. "My father's name was Jedediah Stone. He was a lawman." The words were a declaration of war. Cain's face contorted in a mask of fury. Both men drew their guns in a single fluid motion. 2 shots rang out as one. Silas felt a searing pain in his left arm, but his own aim was true. Rattler Cain cried out, his pistol clattering to the dust as he clutched a bloody hand. His horse reared in panic. Before Cain could recover, Jed was there, stepping out from behind a wagon, his rifle aimed steady at the outlaw's heart. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader disarmed and the battle turned against them, lost their nerve. Some threw down their guns, others fled. Cain stared at Jed, then at Silas, his face a mixture of hatred and disbelief. "Finish it, old man," he spat. Jed walked forward, his eyes hard as flint. "The law you despise is what saves you from a bullet right now, Cain," he said. He took out a pair of handcuffs. "You're under arrest. You'll stand trial for your crimes." For Jedediah Stone, it was the only way, justice, not vengeance. The sun was higher now, burning away the shadows. The battle was over. The townspeople emerged from their homes, their faces pale and ashamed. They saw the dead outlaws. They saw the wounded ranch hand being tended to by Doc Peabody. And they saw Silas, his arm bleeding, standing tall beside the sheriff. His captured father, slumped in defeat. Henderson, the mine foreman, was the first to approach. He stopped in front of Silas, his face filled with remorse. We were wrong," he stammered. "We were fools. You saved us." Thomas and Sarah rushed forward. The blacksmith put a heavy, proud arm around Silas's good shoulder, while Sarah, tears streaming down her face, gently took his hand. "I knew it," she whispered. "I always knew." A month later, Redemption Gulch was healing. The buildings were being repaired, and the fear had been replaced by a quiet, resilient pride. Rattler Cain and his men were gone, handed over to the federal marshals. The stolen payroll had been found in Cain's saddlebags, and the single silver dollar now sat on Jed's desk, a reminder of a dark day overcome. One afternoon, Jed called Silas into his office. He was not wearing his badge. He held it in the palm of his hand, its silver surface worn smooth with time. "I'm tired, son," Jed said, his voice full of a deep, contented weariness. "My time is done." He held out the badge. This was never about blood, Silas. It was about character. You've proven yours tenfold. This town doesn't need me anymore. It needs you. Silas looked at the badge, then at the old man, who had saved him, who had been his true father in every way that mattered. With a steady hand, he took the badge. It was heavy with the weight of responsibility, of honor, of a future he had chosen. He pinned it to his own chest. It felt right. It felt like home. The boy who stole a horse was a boy no more. He was the law. And in the quiet heart of Redemption Gulch, he had finally truly found his redemption. This has been a story about the lines we draw between right and wrong, between justice and vengeance, between the blood in our veins and the choices in our hearts. It's a testament to the fact that a man is not defined by his origins, but by the path he chooses to walk. Silas's journey from a desperate, starving orphan to the savior of a town shows us that one act of mercy, one decision to offer a hand instead of a fist, can ripple through the years, with the force to stop an army and redeem a soul. The West was won not just with guns and grit, but with moments of profound character and unshakable hope. If this story of courage, sacrifice, and redemption moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who loves a true Western drama, and subscribing for more tales from the untamed heart of America. Your support helps us keep these legends alive.